The sun was barely cresting over the maple trees when I spotted them marching across my lawn. A procession of pressed khakis and pastel polos, clipboards clutched tightly as they strode toward my porch with the confidence of people who believed. Rules were weapons. Leading the pack was Karen Wilson, HOA president of neighboring Sycamore Estates, her silver bob catching the morning light as she surveyed my property with thinly veiled contempt. I'd seen that look before. The exact same expression she wore 6 months ago when she tried to fine me for my historical barn's non-conforming color palette. What she didn't realize then, what she still didn't understand now, was that my 5 acres had never been and would never be under her jurisdiction. And I had the property deeds to prove it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Michael Anderson, she announced, my name from her lips sounding like an accusation rather than a greeting. The board has decided it's time we address the security concerns your property poses to our community. I leaned against my porch railing, coffee mug in hand, the weight of what was coming settling into my bones. The early morning dew still clung to the grass beneath their inappropriate dress shoes. Behind Karen stood her loyal followers. Doug Peterson with his perpetual frown, Linda Martinez typing furiously into her phone, and Richard Taylor, arms crossed and smirking as if victory was already theirs. I waited, letting the silence stretch uncomfortably. Karen cleared her throat and extended a small box toward me. We'll need keys to all structures on your property. The board has unanimously agreed that for emergency access purposes, all buildings adjacent to Sycamore Estates must provide entry access to HOA management. The audacity was so breathtaking, I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I took a slow sip of my coffee and studied them over the rim of my mug. My property isn't part of Sycamore Estates. Karen's smile never faltered, but her eyes hardened. Your property impacts our community values. These cottages you've been renting sit directly against our community border. Our CC&Rs are quite clear that any building that affects the aesthetic and security profile of our neighborhood falls under our purview. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I hadn't spent 20 years as a real estate attorney for nothing. Every inch of my property, every converted outbuilding, every historic structure had been meticulously documented and legally protected. The boundaries between my land and their planned community weren't just lines on a map. They were legal fortifications I had personally ensured were impenetrable. I placed my mug on the railing. No. Just one word. But it landed like a stone. In still water, ripples of discomfort spread through the group. Doug's frown deepened. Linda's fingers froze mid-text. "Excuse me?" Karen's voice rose slightly. "I said no. My property predates your development by over a century. I've reviewed your CC&Rs out of courtesy when you tried this last year. They have no legal bearing on my land." Karen's smile disappeared entirely. "Mr. Anderson, perhaps you don't understand the seriousness of this situation. We've had security concerns, break-ins. Your refusal to cooperate could result in significant fines." I didn't blink. I didn't move. "You can't fine property you don't control." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "The board has connections with the city council. I'd hate to see surprise inspections disrupt your rental business." And there it was, the veiled threat, the implied power she thought she wielded. But Karen had just made her first critical mistake. Threats leave traces, and traces become evidence. Is that so? I reached into my pocket and pressed record on my phone. Would you mind repeating that? The moment Karen realized I was recording, her demeanor shifted. The confidence flickered, replaced by something cagey, more calculated. She took a step, back straightening her pastel cardigan. "I'm simply explaining the HOA's position," she said, voice suddenly professional. "We're concerned about community safety." I slipped my phone back into my pocket, the recording secured. "My property is not under your jurisdiction. Your CC&Rs do not apply here. And threatening my business with false complaints to the city isn't neighborhood safety, it's harassment." Richard stepped forward then, his banker's confidence on full display. "Look, Anderson, we're just trying to keep Sycamore Estates secure. Your situation here with all these separate buildings and different tenants coming and going, it creates variables. The board simply wants access in case of emergencies." And what Richard meant by variables was that my property, with its converted farmhouse, renovated barn, and 3 historic cottages, didn't fit their vision of uniform beige houses with matching mailboxes. My 5 acres of lovingly restored historic structures disrupted their carefully controlled aesthetic. Worse, I rented to artists, remote workers, and graduate students who brought diversity to an area they wanted to keep predictable. I looked past Richard to the houses visible just beyond. My property line, identical roof lines marching in perfect formation, each lawn precisely the same shade of green. The contrast with my wildflower meadows and century-old oak trees couldn't have been more stark. "If there's an emergency, that's what first responders are for," I said. "They have the legal authority to enter property when necessary. Your HOA does not." Karen's smile returned, but this time it was sharper. "The board meeting is Thursday evening. We'll expect you to reconsider your position by then. If not, we'll be forced to escalate this matter." She turned on her heel, gesturing for the others to follow. I watched them retreat across my lawn, their backs straight with indignation. Only Linda glanced back, her expression unreadable before she hurried to catch up with the others. Once they were gone, I pulled out my phone and called the one person I knew could help navigate what was coming. "Jessica," I said when she answered, "the Sycamore Estates HOA just demanded keys to all my buildings and threatened to call in false complaints to the city if I refused. I have it recorded." Jessica Chen had been my colleague before I left corporate law to restore my family's historic property. Her response was immediate and reassuring. "Send me the recording. I'll draft a cease and desist by this afternoon. And Michael, document everything from now on." I hadn't wanted this fight. All I'd ever wanted was to preserve this small piece of Oak Ridge's history, to maintain the character of land that had been in my family for generations. But Karen Wilson and her board had just declared war, and I wasn't about to surrender the keys to my kingdom. The next morning dawned with the distinctive sound of an engine idling outside my property. I pulled back the curtains to see a white SUV with Sycamore Estates security emblazoned on the side parked just beyond my property. A line. The driver, a middle-aged man in an ill-fitting uniform, made a show of writing something in a notebook while staring directly at my house. This was Karen's first countermove. Surveillance disguised as security. I documented it with photos before heading to my home office to review the property maps Jessica had requested I send over. The boundaries between my land and Sycamore Estates were clearly defined, but I wanted to be absolutely certain there were no easements or historical quirks that Karen might exploit. My phone buzzed with a text from my neighbor James O'Connor, whose property bordered mine on the side opposite from Sycamore Estates. "You've got an audience today," it read, followed by a photo of 2 more board members walking along the perimeter of my property, stopping occasionally to take pictures. I thanked him for the heads up. James had been my ally since the development went in 3 years ago, watching with increasing dismay as the HOA's influence spread beyond their borders. His historic farmhouse, like mine, stood as a reminder of what Oak Ridge had been before the subdivisions came. Just after noon, while I was on a video call with a client, the distinctive sound of the mail truck rumbling up my driveway caught my attention. I excused myself momentarily to retrieve what was waiting, a certified letter bearing the Sycamore Estates letterhead. I signed for it and returned to my call, but my mind was already racing ahead. This was faster than I'd expected. Karen wasn't waiting for Thursday's meeting after all. When my call ended, I opened the envelope to find a formal notice claiming my property was in violation of numerous community standards. Overgrown vegetation creating vermin habitat, non-compliant. Exterior lighting posing safety hazards, and most absurdly, unauthorized commercial activity in a residential zone. The letter concluded with a demand that I appear before the board to address these violations and provide the requested access keys, or face daily fines of $200 beginning immediately. I photographed the letter and sent it to Jessica, who called me within minutes. "They're overreaching," she said, her voice calm but firm. "They know your property isn't part of their HOA. This is intimidation, pure and simple." "What's their endgame?" I asked, watching through my window as the security vehicle made another slow pass along my property line. "Control," Jessica replied without hesitation. "Your property is the only holdout in an otherwise perfectly controlled area." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. People like Karen Wilson don't sleep well knowing there's something they can't regulate. So what's our move? I've drafted the cease and desist. But more importantly, I've spoken with Thomas Reynolds at the City Planning Office. He confirms what we already know. Your property is zoned historic residential with approved conditional use for short-term rentals. All permits are current and valid. That was the advantage Karen didn't know I had. Before opening my first rental cottage, I'd spent months ensuring every permit, every approval, every historical designation was ironclad. Thomas Reynolds and I had worked closely to navigate the complex zoning requirements for historic properties. He knew my renovations were meticulously done to preserve the historical integrity while meeting all modern safety codes. "There's something else," Jessica added. Reynolds mentioned that Sycamore Estates has been pushing for rezoning of the areas surrounding their development. They've been trying to extend their architectural influence beyond their boundaries. Suddenly, Karen's fixation on my property made more sense. This wasn't just about my rental cottages. It was about absorbing the surrounding properties into their vision for the area. "Send the cease and desist," I told Jessica, "and let's request all communications between the HOA and the city regarding rezoning efforts in the last year." By evening, the security vehicle had been joined by a small group of Sycamore Estates residents who had set up lawn chairs just beyond my property line, ostensibly for a neighborhood watch meeting. Their voices carried clearly across the distance, discussions about property values and community standards, punctuated with glances toward my cottages. I recognized their tactic, public pressure, creating the impression that my property was a community concern requiring oversight. It was harassment masquerading as civic duty. As twilight settled over the meadow, I walked out to my front gate. The conversation among the gathered neighbors stuttered to a halt as I approached. "Good evening," I called, making sure my voice carried. "Just so you know, you're currently trespassing on the public easement. If you'd like to continue your meeting, you might be more comfortable in your community park." A woman I didn't recognize rose from her chair. "This is a public right-of-way. We have every right to be here." "You're correct that it's public," I agreed pleasantly, "which means neither you nor I control it. But blocking access and creating a nuisance are violations of County Ordinance 14(7). I pointed to the small camera mounted discreetly on my fence post. "I've been documenting your gathering for the past 3 hours, including your comments about my property. I'll be sending that footage to the sheriff's department if you haven't moved along in the next 15 minutes. I had no intention of calling the sheriff. Escalating to law enforcement this early would only inflame tensions. But they didn't know that. Slowly, reluctantly, they began packing up their chairs, muttering among themselves. As they dispersed, I noticed Linda Martinez hanging back, hesitating. When the others were out of earshot, she approached my fence. "You should know," she said quietly. "Karen's been preparing for this for months. She has the board convinced. Your property is driving down home values and attracting undesirable elements to the area. And by undesirable elements, you mean my tenants, working professionals and graduate students." Linda glanced over her shoulder. "I'm on the board, but I didn't vote for this. Not all of us agree with how Karen's handling things." She pulled a folded paper from her pocket and handed it to me. "This is the real agenda for Thursday's meeting. Item 6 might interest you." Before I could respond, she hurried away to join the others. I unfolded the paper and scanned down to Item 6, Discussion and Vote. Legal fund allocation for eminent domain consultation regarding Anderson property. My blood ran cold. Eminent domain was a legal process allowing governments to take private property for public use with just compensation. It was meant for roads and public works, not for HOA land grabs. But if they had connections on the city council who could be persuaded that my property was somehow impeding public good. I immediately called Jessica and read her the agenda. "They're desperate," she said after a moment of silence. "Eminent domain requires proving public necessity, and there's no way they can demonstrate that your historic property constitutes a public need. This is a scare tactic. But if they have council connections, then we go on offense," Jessica interrupted. "I've reviewed your deeds. Did you know your property includes a small historical cemetery at the northeast corner?" I did know this. It was a tiny family plot from the 1800s, carefully preserved and maintained as part of the property's historical designation. "That cemetery makes your property virtually untouchable under state historic preservation laws," Jessica continued. "Even with city council connections, they can't touch a designated historic burial site. Karen's either bluffing or hasn't done her homework." For the first time since the confrontation began, I felt my shoulders relax slightly. "So what's our next step?" "We attend Thursday's board meeting," Jessica said, "and we bring reinforcements." Thursday evening arrived with a steady rain that turned the world grey and softened the edges of the manicured Sycamore Estates landscape. I pulled into the community clubhouse parking lot 15 minutes before the meeting was scheduled to begin, unsurprised to find it already nearly full. Jessica was waiting under the portico, elegant in a charcoal suit that radiated competence. Beside her stood Thomas Reynolds from the city planning office, looking slightly uncomfortable but resolute, and James O'Connor, whose presence surprised me. "Hope you don't mind the extra support," Jessica said by way of greeting. "Thomas is here in his official capacity to clarify zoning matters if needed. James reached out to me yesterday. Apparently your HOA friends have been making overtures about his property as well." James nodded grimly. "They sent a friendly neighborhood welcome packet last week, complete with architectural guidelines and a petition to voluntarily adopt their standards." We entered the clubhouse to find the meeting room packed to capacity. At the front, behind a long table, sat the HOA board. Karen at the center, flanked by Doug, Richard, and a visibly nervous Linda. Karen's expression flickered briefly when she saw our group, but she recovered quickly, calling the meeting to order with practiced authority. The meeting progressed through routine matters, landscape contract renewals, pool maintenance schedules, a debate about holiday decoration guidelines. I noted how Karen controlled the room, cutting off questions she didn't like, emphasizing points that supported her position. This was someone accustomed to wielding power, without challenge. Finally, she reached the item that had brought us here. Item 6, Karen announced. Discussion regarding security concerns related to non-conforming properties bordering our community, specifically the Anderson property. She launched into a clearly rehearsed presentation about security incidents, declining property values, and community cohesion. Maps and charts were displayed, showing Sycamore Estates surrounded by what she termed unregulated development that threatened their carefully planned community environment. The board proposes allocating funds for legal consultation regarding potential remedies, including exploring whether the city might consider eminent domain for expansion of community green space. The audacity was stunning, reframing a naked land grab as community enrichment. Several homeowners nodded along, clearly having accepted Karen's narrative without question. When she finished, she looked directly at me. "I see Mr. Anderson has chosen to join us today. Perhaps he'd like to address his continued refusal to cooperate with community safety standards." I rose slowly, feeling every eye in the room upon me. Jessica handed me a folder as I walked to the front. The weight of it in my hands was reassuring. Not just paper, but legal protection, historical validation, the culmination of years ensuring my property was properly documented and defended. "Thank you for allowing me to speak," I began, my voice steady. "I'd first like to introduce Thomas Reynolds from the Westfield County Planning Office, who has kindly agreed to clarify some factual matters regarding zoning and property jurisdiction." Karen's smile froze. This wasn't part of her script. Thomas stepped forward, adjusting his glasses. "Good evening. I've reviewed the property boundaries in question, and I want to clarify that the Anderson property is zoned historic residential with special use permits. It exists outside the Sycamore Estates PUD boundaries and is not subject to your CC&Rs or architectural guidelines." A murmur ran through the crowd. Karen attempted to interject, but Thomas continued. "Furthermore, the property contains a designated historic cemetery, which places it under additional protection under State Historic Preservation Act Section 47. 3. Any attempt to claim this land through eminent domain would face insurmountable legal challenges." I opened the folder and removed several documents, laying them on the table. "These are my property deeds, historical designations, and current permits, all properly filed and maintained. This," I said, placing another document down, "is the cease and desist letter my attorney sent yesterday regarding the harassment and surveillance your board has conducted against my property." Karen's face had lost all color. "We have never harassed. And this," I continued, placing a final document on the table, "is a copy of the recording from our conversation on my porch, where you threatened to use your city council connections to instigate false inspections against my property if I didn't provide keys to my buildings." The room had gone completely silent. Even Doug and Richard were staring at Karen with new expressions: concern, even alarm. "Mr. Anderson," Karen began, her voice tight. "The board was simply expressing concerns." "The board," I interrupted gently. "Or you, Ms. Wilson. Because according to Linda Martinez," I gestured toward the increasingly uncomfortable board member, "this entire campaign was your initiative, not a board consensus." Linda's eyes widened in panic, but she didn't deny it. "I have no desire for conflict," I continued, addressing the room rather than just the board. "My property has existed in harmony with this area for over a century. My tenants are professionals and students who contribute to this community. I maintain historical structures that preserve Oak Ridge's heritage." I gathered my documents, returning them to the folder. I will not be providing keys to my property. I will not submit to HOA regulations that don't apply to my land. And I will not tolerate further harassment, surveillance, or attempts to seize my property through misuse of eminent domain. Jessica stepped forward then, her presence commanding immediate attention. Any further actions against Mr. Anderson's property will result in immediate legal action for harassment and civil rights violations. Any board member participating in such actions could face personal liability. The mood in the room had shifted palpably. Homeowners who had nodded along with Karen's presentation were now exchanging troubled glances. An older gentleman in the back raised his hand. I've lived here since this development was built. I had no idea the board was pursuing action against neighboring properties. I thought we were just discussing security measures. Others murmured agreement. The narrative Karen had carefully constructed was unraveling thread by thread. Karen tried to regain control. This meeting is about protecting our community by attempting to seize historic property through false claims. Thomas Reynolds interjected. Ms. Wilson, the planning office would never support such an action, or by demanding keys to private residences outside your jurisdiction. James added from his seat, because I received the same demand letter yesterday. Karen's gaze darted between faces, searching for allies, finding none. Even Doug and Richard were now leaning away from her slightly, creating physical distance that mirrored their growing reluctance to be associated with her actions. I move that we table item 6 pending legal review, Linda said suddenly, her voice shaky but determined, and that we suspend any actions regarding properties outside our boundaries until such review is complete. Seconded, called someone from the audience. Karen had no choice but to call the vote. It passed overwhelmingly. As the meeting moved to other business, I quietly exited with Jessica, Thomas, and James. In the parking lot, rain still falling. Softly around us, Jessica smiled. That went better than expected. It's not over, I cautioned. Karen won't back down easily. No, Jessica agreed, but she's lost her mandate. Without board support, she's just one person with a grudge. Thomas shook my hand firmly. I'll make sure the planning office keeps your file flagged. Any inquiries about your property will come directly to my attention. As they departed, I stood for a moment in the rain, looking back at the clubhouse. Through the windows, I could see Karen still at the front table, but the dynamic had changed. Board members were engaged in discussion without deferring to her. Homeowners were speaking up, asking questions she clearly didn't want to answer. Her power, so carefully cultivated, was slipping away not because of my confrontation, but because her own overreach had exposed the truth. She had been using the HOA as a personal tool, not a community resource. I drove home through the gathering. Darkness, the rain washing away the tension of the past days. My cottages came into view, warm lights glowing behind windows that had stood for over 100 years. No HOA had dictated their design. No community guidelines had restricted their character. They were unique, historical, imperfect, and absolutely worth protecting. 3 weeks later, I received official notification that Karen Wilson had resigned from the HOA board, citing personal reasons. The new board president, surprisingly, was Linda Martinez, who called me personally to assure me that all actions against my property had been permanently suspended. We're refocusing on actually serving our community, she explained, not trying to expand our borders. The security vehicle never returned. The surveillance stopped. The threatening letters ceased. My tenants continued their peaceful lives, and I continued preserving my small piece of Oak Ridge history. Sometimes, standing on my porch in the evening, I can see residents from Sycamore Estates walking along the public path that borders my wildflower meadow. They no longer stare at my property with suspicion, but often wave or nod in greeting. Many have started to visit the farm stand I opened at my front gate, selling produce from my heirloom vegetable garden. In the end, what Karen never understood was that boundaries aren't just lines on property maps. They're principles to be respected, histories to be preserved, and communities to be built through cooperation, not control. She had demanded keys to my kingdom, never realizing that the real power wasn't in controlling access. It was in creating something worth protecting in the first place. The moment Karen realized I was recording, her demeanor shifted. The confidence flickered, replaced by something casier, more calculated. She took a step back, straightening her pastel cardigan. "I'm simply explaining the HOA's position," she said, voice suddenly professional. "We're concerned about community safety." I slipped my phone back into my pocket, the recording secured. "My property is not under your jurisdiction. Your CCNRs do not apply here. And threatening my business with false complaints to the city isn't neighborhood safety, it's harassment." Richard stepped forward then, his banker's confidence on full display. "Look, Anderson, we're just trying to keep Sycamore Estates secure. Your situation here, with all these separate buildings and different tenants coming and going, it creates variables. The board simply wants access in case of emergencies." What Richard meant by variables was that my property, with its converted farmhouse, renovated barn, and 3 historic cottages, didn't fit their vision of uniform beige houses with matching mailboxes. My 5 acres of lovingly restored historic structures disrupted their carefully controlled aesthetic. Worse, I rented to artists, remote workers, and graduate students who brought diversity to an area they wanted to keep predictable. I looked past Richard to the houses visible just beyond my property line, identical roof lines marching in perfect formation, each lawn precisely the same shade of green. The contrast with my wildflower meadows and century-old oak trees couldn't have been more stark. "If there's an emergency, that's what first responders are for," I said. "They have the legal authority to enter property when necessary. Your HOA does not." Karen's smile returned, but this time it was sharper. "The board meeting is Thursday evening. We'll expect you to reconsider your position by then. If not, we'll be forced to escalate this matter." She turned on her heel, gesturing for the others to follow. I watched them retreat across my lawn, their backs straight with indignation. Only Linda glanced back, her expression unreadable, before she hurried to catch up with the others. Once they were gone, I pulled out my phone and called the one person I knew could help navigate what was coming. "Jessica," I said when she answered, "the Sycamore Estates HOA just demanded keys to all my buildings and threatened to call in false complaints to the city if I refused. I have it recorded. Jessica Chen had been my colleague before I left corporate law to restore my family's historic property. Her response was immediate and reassuring. Send me the recording. I'll draft a cease and desist by this afternoon. And Michael, document everything from now on." I hadn't wanted this fight. All I'd ever wanted was to preserve this small piece of Oak Ridge's history, to maintain the character of land that had been in my family for generations. But Karen Wilson and her board had just declared war, and I wasn't about to surrender the keys to my kingdom. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.